Thank you everyone for joining this closing session of the first day of Helix Digital, kindly sponsored by One Nucleus partner, BioMed Realty. One of the reasons BioMed came on board to discuss this topic of scaling up a biotech ecosystem is because of the key role that they play in life science ecosystems themselves. They don't just provide a roof for scientists' head, they provide a place to enable innovation to happen, and importantly, to plan that years ahead, how they should look like. That's the reason why it is my pleasure to invite BioMed Realty CEO, Tim Schoen, to give us his insight on how he is seeing our own Cambridge ecosystem with his own US West Coast lens. After his presentation, Tim will be joined by a panel chaired by Mike Ward, Global Head of Thought Leadership at Clarivate, to discuss these questions around scaling up a biotech ecosystem. So Tim, if you would like to join me on this digital flow, it is all yours. You're on your team.
I hit it twice, sorry. Thanks, Aileen. Thanks to the One Nucleus team and Tony and Aileen for putting it together. Second year we've been apart, unfortunately. I look forward to this event. It's the height of the year, literally and figuratively. So, but anyway, glad to be part of it, and thank Mike for chairing the panel here later today. We're in about 10 minutes and putting some work in here to get us all organized. But if you could pull up the presentation, we'll walk through a few things. There's been a lot of talk about infrastructure in the United States and throughout the world. And that's really at essence of what we do. We're an infrastructure provider. We're one of the key elements that exist in an ecosystem. If you go to page 2, just to give you an idea of the company, it's a fully integrated platform. See if we can go to the next page here. See if it'll pull up. Perfect. Which is really a portfolio in the United States and the UK. We're a fully integrated franchise providing really mission critical real estate in all the core life science markets around the country and in the UK. We have a portfolio that's about 13.5 million feet in Boston, San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, New York, and Cambridge, UK. We serve about 250 life science and technology tenants at various stages of their life science cycle. And we've got a fully integrated platform. And by that, I mean, we've got 230 professionals that come in every day and work on life science relationships, leasing, development, acquisitions, marketing, facilities, finance, accounting, risk management. And more importantly, we've got a pipeline. We've really got a portfolio, a platform, and a pipeline. And the last piece, the pipeline, is really growing the platform with really state-of-the-market buildings that allow scientists and companies to attract and retain talent. We've got an additional 5 or 6 million square feet that we can add into our portfolio. And that pipeline is actually where about 70% of all VC funding happens in the United States and about 70 to 75% in the UK. And we're actively looking for ways to continue to grow this pipeline in all markets, including the UK. Our locations are anchored by academic and research institutions, deep talent pools, capital providers, and thriving commercial life science and technology businesses. It's really the intersection creates unique centers of excellence and a density of sustainable life science ecosystem like you see here in the UK. If you go to the next page here, supported on our team, we have our president of the East Coast and UK markets, Bill Kane. Each of these individuals brings a lot of experience in the sector. We have our Salzino, our vice president of development. Colleen O'Connor has our leasing in both Cambridge, US and UK. But more importantly, we have 2 high caliber real estate professionals leading our UK efforts. Orestes Zortolu, who's our senior director of development, and Matt Smith, our development of leasing. So for those of you that are in or around Cambridge, hopefully you'll see them and we'll see more of each other. Going to the next page, on page 4, we have a large portfolio that really offers a large range of options for lab, R&D, and state-of-the-art build-to-suit campuses. We go anywhere from startup companies to larger blue chip companies, But more importantly, in a portfolio, we like to say that if you lease 1 square foot from us, you really get 13 million square feet of options. And the orange highlights several of the larger UK tenants and relationships. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. Page 5 is the integrated platform I mentioned, so that when folks in our business and the infrastructure, they care about who their landlord is, and we have a lot of experience really managing and building and developing mission critical real estate for all types of research, whether it's diabetes, cancer, liquid biopsy, other sort of cutting edge technologies. They all have a common denominator in terms of how the buildings function and operate. We really, at our essence, we allow our tenant partners to focus on science and research while we focus on the real estate, so they're not bogged down with that aspect of the infrastructure. Slide 6 just gives you an idea of sort of what we'd like to call state of the market product. It allows tenants to use their real estate as a tool, as I mentioned before, to attract and retain talent. Slide 7 as well, with the development pipeline, it allows us to, our development and redevelopment allows us to produce some of the most sustainable buildings. The isolated nature of the pandemic reinforced the importance of community that is central to our model. Companies find that our cluster model provides a desirable workplace for tenants to collaborate, connect, and really build a community. But as employees head back to the office en masse, we'll need to provide reassurances that the workplaces are employing state-of-the-art technologies to ensure safe and healthy work environments. And we're happy to say that, either from a digital connection and a wired score to a BREEAM or a WELL score, we've done really well in some of the buildings that we're actively developing and redeveloping. Moving to page 8 and 10, go to page 8. If you would. The life science industry is really a sort of a conviction industry for Blackstone. They acquired Claris funds in 2018, and sorry, I'm switching my view here. It's important just to show here that it's not just about real estate and infrastructure; it's also about investment in the industry. So we're in a very unique perspective that we've got, $20 billion of real estate, US dollars, and then about $7 billion invested in the industry. And then you put the big data science on top of that. I'll use a tech term here. I think we've created a killer app, as our friends in Silicon Valley would say. For a long time, biotech was known as the other tech. Obviously, with the pandemic, we've been put at the forefront. So, having a sponsor that's really has a conviction to this industry, not only the real estate, has been helpful for us as we look and work with tenants. And we've collaborated across in the U.S. in a group called Alnylam, where Blackstone's put a couple $1 billion in, and they have their research in our buildings in Kendall Square in Boston. Going to the next page. And then just click through. This is BX Life Sciences. They've contributed to almost 114 different drugs and medicines that have gotten approval over time. We can move through this fairly quickly. Go to the next page. And really have full funded solutions at all different stages across the life cycle. So moving to the next page. And just a sample of the development deals they've done. The ones again highlighted in orange are associated with the UK. So again, a lot of cross functionality between the US and the UK, given the importance of these sort of super clusters. We can go to the next page. Now, this one I want to spend a little bit of time on because it really talks about the importance of the UK ecosystem, and it's very unique in different parts of the United States, or different parts of the US and the UK. A lot of people say the UK punches above its weight. I think that's a misnomer. It does in some respects. It ranks 5th globally for R&D spend. It's home to 4 of the top 20 universities. It's got 53 teaching hospitals, 74 life science clusters across the country, delivering 32 million square feet. It's the 5th highest in terms of patent applications. And if you look at, the government support, it's number 2 in the world. And the one that I like to point out is the talent. It graduates a high level of people with mathematics and engineering degrees, and really number 1 in the world. So it really has all the really key components. And you look at the scorecard, and that this area and this country can compete with anywhere in the world, just given the fact that it's got all the key components to the ecosystem. Go ahead to the next page. So the elements of sort of a successful life science ecosystem. If you look at this, and I'm gonna look at mine because it's a little small on my screen. So these are what we like to call the 4 tribes, or the 4 groups that really make up an ecosystem, and what makes it so strong. You've got really, you start with the science and research and the academic and talent pool. And then you add in the venture capitalists, and then folks that are in the business and the industry forming a business around a technology. And then you've got the government support. And then I would argue you've got the infrastructure, which we represent. When you get these tribes or these groups together, they all speak their own language. But when they get together, it's a very, very, very powerful force. And I would argue between tech and science, it's probably the biggest force that we're seeing in the world today, the convergence of tech and science. But I think we'll spend a little bit more talking about this with Mike on the panel later. But this is really sets the formation of the four or 5 groups that we look at, and what creates a powerful ecosystem. The next thing we'll talk about, if you can go to the next page, is really scaling up. And I'll do it from an infrastructure perspective, where we take the real estate, and we start with something like the Babraham Institute and the BBT and Derek Jones and his team, who have done a great job of creating a real micro ecosystem with 60 or 70 companies. And then you have a lot of amenities that support the groups, and a lot of services to support these companies that are very, very early stage and can't support a full team, and you create buildings of different sizes that incubate these groups. And then we were fortunate enough in the last several years to add a couple of buildings that have allowed them to scale tenants up from really a few thousand feet all the way up to 25 to 50,000 feet, and keep folks on the campus. And that's what we did with what we call BMR at Babraham. So really expanding on the success that had already been there. And then going to a more established companies like we see at Granta Park, Pfizer, Gilead, Illumina, MedImmune, or AstraZeneca. You see, the larger blue chip companies, and you can see how the infrastructure can play a role in all components as you scale up a system. And then we'll move through the next one. Focusing on Babraham itself. Move to the next slide. That's great. And here, it's created one of the more unique ecosystems from cradle to big pharma in and around Cambridge. The BRC is home to at least 60 companies, probably 70 now. I haven't caught up with Derek lately, but we've really worked with BBT and Derek Jones and his experienced team, along with the BBSRC over the last 3 years, as I mentioned, to create 2 new lab buildings to really help support that scale up and help these companies grow. Because for these companies, the speed to science is of critical importance, and their ability to get into the labs and get working quickly. Speed is of the essence. So providing that infrastructure is super important. Moving on to the next page, you can see where we've taken some of the modern amenities and buildings and added to the Babraham offering, and then going to Granta again, where we see sort of the larger companies. Going to the next page, on page 17. But where I really want to spend the most time here is the comparison across markets. I think that's the most important thing that we focus on. And I'm going to go to that. If you go to the next page here. And here, I think we see a really good comparison across the markets. You see government support in a meaningful way across all of these markets. You see VC funding, what I mentioned in one of those groups and tribes. You see a large number of companies, over 100 in all these locations, but you see some top key employers in all the markets. If you think about, San Francisco, which is on the right, that really started with Genentech. It's now Roche. It's home to AbbVie, Bristol Myers Squibb, Merck, Verily, Gilead today. So it's become an ecosystem over time, but it really started with one company that grew out of it and became what we call the children and the grandchildren of or really the great grandchildren now of Genentech. You have the same thing, I think, when you look at Cambridge, UK, and you see AZ that's planted its flag. You have Illumina, Nap Pharma, Amgen, and Kymab. You have a lot of key companies that could grow over time, and particularly in Kymab's situation, where they've got some of the scientists that have come and worked at different companies over time. And then you look at Cambridge and you think about what's there, Cambridge, US, and you think about Takeda, although it's not on the page, Genzyme, which was Henry Tremeer's company, did a lot of orphan research, or research on orphan diseases that typically hadn't got a lot of attention, which spun off a lot of scientists into different types of technologies. You've got Pfizer, Sanofi, and Novartis, and Alnylam, a lot of key companies that are driving the industry today. But also, when you look at the market growth, you think about 17,000 life science employees in the UK, a really, really critical mass that you don't see many places in the world. Obviously, someplace like San Francisco has a much bigger geographic area because you can take in both sides of the bay. And then in Boston, you've got about 48,000. But all three have, again, core critical components. And I would argue in the UK, given the amount of talent in science and folks with science and mathematical degrees that are coming out into the market, that the UK will continue to accelerate. What you see in terms of growth is very similar, anywhere between 40 and just over 50% growth over time. So you continue to see the market and the infrastructure continue to grow, as well as the industry. And then there's some, some key dates that you can take a look through here, but you see, in Cambridge, UK, obviously AZ coming. I use the analogy of Genentech or Roche in the US. That helps anchor and provide a big employer and bring a lot of talent to the area. And then it's got its own homegrown biotech companies, like recently Bicycle Therapeutics that IPO'd on the NASDAQ not too long ago. And you obviously have the support of the universities as well. And then I think something that gets overlooked, at least from our perspective, is really the planning commissions and the planning groups that are really supportive. We've been able to work with them over the last 7 or 8 years as we continue to expand the infrastructure, and they've been extremely supportive and provided guidance as we've looked to add infrastructure and buildings into the community. Going to the next page. I think, Mike, that'll be a good one when we get to the panel to talk about the different markets. And then just to summarize, the UK fundamentals are extremely strong with the clusters that we talked about. It's got all the components, breakthrough technology advances. Many of the key challenges we'll face, we've seen what can happen when we have a healthcare crisis. People ask, there's a lot of debate about how much money or government support we put towards research. I think now in the last year, we've asked the question, what is the cost of a pandemic? It goes in the billions or trillions of dollars. So, again, having been known as the other tech for so long and having biotech be put front and center, I think will be very, very good for the growth of the life science sector. And then, in the UK, you've got the government's renewed commitment to the life science sector, which is great. You've got the UKRI. I think you can't underestimate those groups of the research councils, or the government bodies that has 9 research councils. We've worked closely with the BBSRC over time to help provide buildings and infrastructure. But I think the UKRI, as well as the academic institutions, these councils are very important. I mentioned AZ, and the VC funding, although it is less in dollars in terms of what we see in Boston and San Francisco, it's still pretty impressive. It's competing with areas like San Diego now in terms of the amount in dollars that are raised. And that just seems to be gaining continued momentum. And then, again, just the response to the industry and the focus on the industry from the pandemic. With that, I tried to keep it, I ran over a little bit, but I'll turn it back over to Aileen.
That was perfect, Tim. Thank you very much. And actually a really good scene setter for the upcoming discussion. So now I would like to invite Mike and the panel to join us, and I will leave it to you to discuss these very important questions hinted in Tim's presentation of what is a biotech ecosystem? Does it really have to scale up? And if yes, how do we collectively contribute to that? With this caveat of in a brave new world that I remind you is the overarching theme of Helix this year. And because it's a very important discussion for all of us, I would welcome any comments or questions in the chat box, and I will pass them on to Mike. So Mike, over to you.
So thanks very much, Aileen. I'm Mike Ward, Global Head of Thought Leadership at Clarivate, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this closing panel, scaling up a biotech ecosystem. And I'm going to introduce the panelists, and I'm going to do it in alphabetical order. So we have John Baker, who has held a number of senior positions at Abcam and is currently the Senior Vice President Marketing. Jeremy Carmichael, who has been with Aztecs Pharmaceuticals for 20 years and is currently the Senior Vice President Corporate Development at the company. Jane Dancer, who is an independent consultant with plenty of experience in Cambridge-based biotechs, Cambridge Analytical Technology, Cellzone, and FSTAR, and she's currently a non-exec chair at both Spiria and PharmEnable, and a non-exec director at Macomix and Nanosyrinx. We have James Fry. He's a partner at Mills and Reeves, and there James he heads up the firm's life sciences practice. So he's supporting clients in the sort of pharma, biotech, medical device, diagnostics, medtech, and digital health sectors. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome back BioMed Realty's Tim Schoen. So I'd actually first like to thank Tim for his presentation. Not only does it make my life easier as a moderator of this discussion, because he so eloquently provided a comparison between the leading hotspots in the world and what we have here in the UK. And as Aileen said, it is a perfect launchpad for our discussion. I'd just like, one of the things that Tim sort of was highlighting was, for example, the amount of finance that's going into the biotech sector, and he was sort of saying that the UK is now pushing ahead of other places. In some financing numbers that were released today by the Bioindustry Association, which I helped compile using Clarivate data, including BioWorld, what we were able to say is that the biotech sector, the UK biotech sector, in the past 6 months has raised as much money as it did in the whole of 2020, and that in itself had been sort of the previous record year. And also in the last 3 months, the UK was third, just behind Massachusetts and the San Francisco Bay Area when it came to raising VC. And actually, the UK raised 10% of the global sum in biotech VCs, and it's therefore ahead of San Diego and mainland China. So it's sort of vying for those sort of championship places. So the access to capital, though, is clearly not the only important component to the sustainable development of an ecosystem. It's just one of those. And in fact, Michael Porter, who, in his sort of seminal work, The Competitive Advantage of Nations, and that work is the one that sort of underpins much of the sort of the drive of policymakers to actually sort of, create clusters, he made the observation that a country's most competitive companies tend to actually geographically co-locate and are therefore concentrated in just a few spaces. So that was clearly one of the things that you can see why policymakers will sort of say, well, hey, how can we encourage that coalescence? In his presentation, Tim highlighted some of the key elements that are the building blocks of the most successful ecosystems. So to kick off the discussion, it's my plan to ask each of the panelists to maybe give us sort of an additional sort of introduction to themselves in terms of where their activities fit within the ecosystem, and also maybe to pick out what they think out of those pillars that that Tim was identifying, what they think is the most essential component that can actually transform a promising cluster into a fully functioning ecosystem. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with John. So John, Abcam is clearly one of the companies that's based here. How has the company sort of benefited for being located in what is known as the Golden Triangle? And in your opinion, what is the key elements of this location in your company's rather impressive growth trajectory of recent years?
Without starting off on a downer, I think less than we would have hoped over the years, Mike. And it may be that we were too early. So Abcam, for those who don't know us, we're in our sort of late adolescence, I suppose, as an organization. Now mid-cap, utterly dependent on Cambridge for our foundation. So our founders were, Jonathan was a postdoc on Tennis Court Road, which some of you will know well, and a series of local angels helped him get off the ground. So the Cambridge cluster was vital to Abcam's foundation. And we absolutely agree with Tim, and I'm sure others on the panel, that there are all of the ingredients here. Those four tribes, as Tim described them, I think make total sense, particularly around the talent. For us, the presence of VC is less relevant than it would once have been, but the companies and partners that come with it should be exciting. I think what we have struggled with over the past few years is that while the individual elements doubtless exist here or in the triangle or the arc, or however you want to characterize it, they've not necessarily been as well joined together as perhaps we see in our operations either in Boston or in the Bay or in Shanghai, where there seems to be a little more of a well-established plumbing between the talent and the VC and the infrastructure. And perhaps also two other pillars or columns, if I dare add them, Tim. One, I think, is that infrastructure which is less around the businesses and more around the people and where they're going to live and where they're going to send their kids to school, etc., where we've seen Cambridge really struggle. And we've found that a barrier to getting really good talent to commit to Cambridge, whether they're starting local or we're trying to bring them in. I think the other piece which we've found challenging over the years is that once you get beyond VC, while of course UK private equity is very active and increasingly active in our sector, the public markets in the UK perhaps have been less receptive to growth biotech stories than the US. And you've recently seen us and AZ and many others go down the NASDAQ route to access perhaps a more biotech savvy analyst pool and investor set. So I think we're really excited that organizations such as this, also I think a more joined up perspective to planning, starting with the biomedical campus, now thinking about how that joins into Babraham and the other great clusters. I think we're really seeing it come together and excited about what that can do for the next wave of the company's growth. But perhaps we've been sort of chomping at the bit for the last 5 or 6 years to see how those pieces might come together. You're muted, Mike.
Again, I think I did what Tim did with sort of 2 clicks. As I was saying, you described yourself as an adolescent company, and it did sort of appear at the start that you were the sort of that classic grumpy teenager, whatever. But I think some of the points that you raised are ones that we will return to. You sort of particularly around that sort of almost like who is going to be the driver to get that plumbing, right? Who is the sort of the Mario, to come back to the sort of like the teenage heroes. So I'm going to go to Jeremy now. So Jeremy, Aztecs Pharmaceuticals, again, this is a company that it started in Cambridge, back in the sort of the late 90s. It's been through quite a lot of growth. It had that merger with Supergen, and then was the subsequent acquisition by Otsuka, the Japanese pharmaceutical company, which therefore meant that you were able to spread your wings geographically. So, from your perspective, what do you sort of look and sort of think is sort of the most important attributes a cluster needs to have to help nurture a fully functioning ecosystem?
Thanks, Mike. So I can give you Astex's perspective and describe some of the advantages of the cluster that we're in, and some of the challenges as well, which John has also alluded to. So I think that fundamentally for us and for the sector as a whole, I think that the quality of our research is probably key to any cluster, and I think that that's where I would start. One of the other things that I would say is that each of us in turn is so focused on being successful at what we do, running our companies, or building infrastructure, or government support, that I think in our day-to-day working, we're not really focused on the cluster. We're just focused on making our businesses a success. And sometimes it takes us to step back and say, are we doing enough to actually help support the cluster in other ways, or are there other ways that we could actually do that within our role? But I do think that the quality of the science is fundamentally important. And I think if you look at all of those areas that have been successful in building a cluster, the focus has been on quality innovation coming out of leading research institutes, and that leading to people thinking about other ways in which to advance those innovations through a company rather than just academic research. And that's why you find even across the UK, all of the biotech that emerges tends to be focused around our leading research universities, and I think that is that is fundamentally important. And certainly that's the history of Astex. So as well as someone who was more industry savvy, so Haran Jyoti, who founded Astex, was working in Glaxo Wellcome at the time and sort of had this idea to do something slightly different, and then working with Professor Sir Tom Blundell at Cambridge, and also the late Professor Chris Abel, also a Cambridge University professor. They had this idea to actually start this company. So again, the quality of the science that actually underpinned that was vitally important, and I think that that's contributed largely to Astex's success in a challenging environment, because I think it has been challenging to grow a biotech company in the UK. But it's because we always focus on scientific rigor and advancing the best science that we can possibly do. And that's something that you can then go on and actually do business. We can run collaborations with others who appreciate the quality of that science. So I would say that that's probably the key. Yes, you need the infrastructure, you need the finance, and you need government support. But I think the support for basic fundamental research is what we should always try and come back to and focus on.
Right, I shall make sure that I've got my mute button switched off this time. So thanks very much, Jeremy. And again, some important points that I think that we will sort of reflect on a little bit later on in the discussion. So I'm going to turn to Jane now. So Jane, much of your career has been with sort of Cambridge-based biotechs, two of which actually were acquired by major pharmaceutical companies. In Tim's presentation, he highlighted the importance of having sort of big players operating in a cluster. So I was just wondering, so from your perspective, what are the benefits for those smaller companies that you're now supporting in setting themselves up in a place that has an established cluster or infrastructure?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. You'll notice I'm unmuted myself very early, so I didn't do the double unmute like some of you. So yeah, before talking about the early stage companies, I mean, just to reflect, I've been in the Cambridge ecosystem for many years, and I've been fortunate enough to work for a number of great companies of various stages, all the way from sort of AstraZeneca down to companies of 20 or so people that we've grown. And I think what's also interesting is that two of those companies, in fact, Cellzome and F-Star, neither of those actually came from Cambridge. They both gravitated towards Cambridge because of this sort of inexorable pull that comes from the cluster. And what those companies, I think, really were attracted by was the access to talent. I mean, particularly in the case of F-Star, they were doing phage display. They were founded in Austria, but really needed to get that up and running. And the place to do any sort of antibody phage display work was Cambridge. So it was natural that they came over and set up there. And of course, the end of that story is they've now gone on and they're listed on NASDAQ. So, great story. It's interesting then reflecting on the tribes that Tim presented. I really like that, and I think it's looking at what each company needs in the stage of its journey. It'll obviously change as it grows up. So if John's the grumpy adolescent company, I don't know where Jeremy sits in the spectrum. I suppose I represent the sort of infants, the babies who are just kind of getting started. And let's remember that both Abcam and Astex were babies at some point and benefited from what Cambridge has given. So it's great that we have a really vibrant startup scene which provides the shoots which are going to generate these really successful companies in the future, as well as the ones which are actually being generated elsewhere and are coming across here to grow and to thrive. But I think when I look at the startup companies that I'm working with and thinking about what's most important to them, I mean, most of them actually have the science. So it's almost the other way around to what Jeremy's saying. They usually have very bright scientific founders, academics with great ideas. And I think the one thing that they really benefit from in Cambridge is getting the sort of business advice. And unfortunately, in Cambridge, we have this fantastic community, this network, which, I mean, I remember 20 years ago when I was doing my MBA, I was just blown away by the fact that the great and the good, the sort of Andy Richards and people would actually give time to speak to a mere MBA student. And really that's still there, and actually it's increased. There's a lot of people who are out to support and to recycle, and people now who have the experience that's needed to help these youngsters grow up. And of course, on top of the informal networks, we've got loads of fantastic schemes now. All the incubators that have been set up, the accelerators, the One Nucleus does a lot here with the incubator at Babram, and then I was at the Judge Institute, and they have their accelerator, their start codon, which helps them then get out of their nappies and grow up a bit, and so that they can really get up and running. And I think it's that more than anything which these companies need, and they need someone to help them grow their idea, or quite frankly to tell them it's a rubbish idea and they're better just to go back and do something else instead. On top of that, thinking about the other tribes, yes, money's obviously important. Again, if you look at very early stage companies, unlike John, who has to kind of go to the US to get his cash, generally very early companies tend to access their money from local investors because, again, it's the sort of network effect. And here in Cambridge, we've got the Cambridge Business Angels, we've got other people who are putting their money that they've made out of biotech back into biotech. I mean, Jonathan Milner is an investor in two of the companies that I chair, PharmEnable and Spirea, and it's just great to have him on board. And there are VCs also who are prepared to fund very early stage companies. Government support, yes, through grant funding, but perhaps less critical at the stage that I'm working in. But I couldn't, of course, not mention infrastructure after Tim's presentation. And I think here there are two types of companies. There are those that need wet lab space. They need to move out of their academic labs and do the killer experiment, which is going to prove whether they really have something or not. And I think that's an area that we really need to pay attention to, that we can provide, even if it's just a bench and a few pipettes or whatever they need, but affordable space that they can get themselves going. Interesting, I also work with companies which are digital, so they don't need any wet lab space. In fact, they can run almost entirely virtual. So for them, perhaps the infrastructure is less critical. but all the other good stuff they need. So a little bit of a different picture perhaps to where John is, but that's natural. As we grow up, we need different things in life, don't we?
Yeah, that's great, Jane. And I mean, it's interesting you sort of talk about talent, because I've chaired a number of these panels in the past, sort of focusing on this, and one of the things is about talent, and the fact that you have a talent pool that means that people can move from one company to another if necessary. And we know that not all companies are necessarily successful, but at least if you've uprooted and you've uprooted your kids to get them to the I'm sure they've got very, very good schools in Cambridge, but at least that you're not sort of left out hung and dry. So I'm now going to come to James. James, at Mills and Reeve, right? You're advising companies across the whole of the ecosystem. You sort of mentioned the sort of the types of companies that you're supporting. It'd be interesting to hear from your perspective on whether it's actually necessary, if you think it's necessary for companies to locate into bioclusters, to be able to sort of develop and achieve sustainable critical mass as businesses.
I could probably answer the question, Mike, with one word, which I think is yes. But I think it's all about the importance of place, isn't it? And that's been debated throughout the pandemic. And I think whilst we've all learned a lot about how we can use technology more effectively and tap into wider audiences, I do think that for a sector such as ours, place and place within a cluster remains and will remain important. I think theoretically you could say it's not a prerequisite for a business to achieve critical mass to locate in a cluster, but it's incredibly helpful. It really smooths the wheels. And I think it really gives companies the best chance to thrive and to execute their business plans. I think businesses will look to different things that a cluster brings, and I think that sort of leads to it's getting the mix right. I mean, I think a lot of the panelists have talked about things like community, which I think is critically important. So for all the reasons that panelists have given already, location really in a cluster drives those benefits. So researchers and companies having easy access to capital, advisors, facilities, knowledge and talent. Agree with Jane in terms of private capital, public markets within the UK, still an issue, but clearly concentration in a cluster means that you have the ears of investors. But I think one of the key thing is around the X factor, if you like, that being in a cluster brings. I think in Cambridge we've got a bit of a balance here, because you've still got that village feel, but you have that really strong network, almost that sort of striking sense of camaraderie, as people often mention. And I think also, and I know John sort of mentioned about Abcam being the grumpy teenager, but it's the likes of Abcam who have been able to scale within the city, within the cluster, and actually the cluster is a lot richer as a result of it. And we've got those businesses scaling within the cluster, and that gives the richness of talent, the richness of experience as well. So access to NED networks, but also I think in terms of accelerating the speed of development, because actually you can do that through collaboration, and you can do that through local collaboration. So I think long-winded way, Mike, of saying yes, but I think it remains and will remain really important.
So just as a follow-up, because in Tim's presentation, he came up with a number, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something like there are 72 clusters or bioclusters in the UK, which was, you know, I thought, whoa. But, you know, normally when people sort of talk about the sort of biotech cluster here in the UK, we always tend to sort of focus on the Golden Triangle, and because it's the On Helix meeting, that is entirely appropriate. But there are other places, and I was just sort of wondering whether, in fact, should we see the UK as one cluster, as opposed to sort of a myriad, or one ecosystem as opposed to sort of a myriad, because actually it is fairly easy to communicate, you know, across the country. So I just sort of, you know, maybe ask you to sort of comment on that, James, and then maybe some of the other panelists would like to you know, have a stab at that, because I'm then going to come to Tim, because this is sort of a preamble to my question for him anyway.
Yeah, okay, Mike. So it's almost the sort of the jigsaw effect, if you like, because actually I think it's individual clusters sort of making best use of what they are famous for in many ways. So we're a national law firm. Our office in Cambridge is the largest office. We have about 400 people in Cambridge. So we are in East Anglian practice. That's where we've grown up. But we have a thriving business up in the northwest, for example, and do work with businesses on orderly and within the Midlands and elsewhere. I do think that it's about clusters within the UK working together effectively, not almost sort of recreating the wheel, but working together. I mean, I suppose if we use an analogy here, you've got a great cluster of CROs in Nottingham, for example. There is that engagement between, say, the Nottingham and the Cambridge cluster in terms of supporting pharma and biotech businesses. And so that is an example of how clusters work together. But I think if you pull that jigsaw together effectively, I think Cambridge has sort of a leading and preeminent role to play within that. Then I think we'll get on to sort of how we compare against the US. That may be a more powerful proposition.
I think, if I may, there's clusters operate at different scales, right? I think there's, to Jane's point, and I'm going to try and row back from the grumpiness at this point, but to Jane's point, yeah, there's that wonderful richness of chance meetings and mentorship and so on that really happens effectively within biking range and has almost to be defined in those terms. That if it isn't walkable or cyclable, I think to many of our early career employees, it might as well be the other side of the moon. You know, it's got to be super local, and I think Cambridge does that well, if not quite at the level of maturity that Kendall Square has. And then there's, I think, the opportunity for a broader cluster, which is the Golden Triangle and Nottingham and whatever else, which can pit itself perhaps against the Greater Boston equivalent of where you have that super cluster that spans Kendall Square to Waltham to whichever other life science rich parts of Greater Boston you want to mention. So I think it's useful to think about multiple scales and nodes within a broader cluster. I think that's an opportunity we have to be able to join Cambridge to Oxford to London to Nottingham to wherever more effectively.
Jane.
Yeah.
And no, sorry, you go, Jane.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I'd be interested, how you define a cluster to come to 74. And then the other thing to think about as well, just going forwards, I wonder, and Tim, you alluded to how you're making sure that the space that you provide is all digital now. But to what extent, now that we all work virtually, that's going to perhaps begin to sort of blur the boundaries a bit. And whereas before, certainly in my company, it was essential to have everyone, they were required to come in every day. And now, particularly in the sorts of functions that I did, business development, we now recognise more and more that we can be anywhere in the world as long as we can, jump on a Zoom call when we're needed.
Yeah, I should have used the word nodes, by the way, instead of clusters. So, John, thanks for saving me on that one. But at 32 million feet, though, it's, that is a critical mass that would easily compete with Massachusetts or say in San Francisco, where we have 28 million feet. So, if we looked at it as Mike, I think you said sort of, we looked at it as one cluster, or James said as one cluster, you would see it compete with anywhere in the world in terms of its size and scale.
And I think, I think if we take the UK as a whole, I think that we have to accept that it's an imperative for the development agencies and the government to support economic development across the UK. So it's actually not in our gift to say somebody should be the cluster and somebody should be, if there's good research happening across the UK, then that will spurn ideas, and people will want to try and start up biotech companies. The different areas will have different challenges, but I think we have to accept that if we can support them in different ways to actually make the most of what they have, then we should see it as a UK-wide endeavor. And I think it's a long-term endeavor as well. And I think that, you do see that in all parts of the country. And yes, you will have areas like Nottingham that have a particular specialism, and CROs, will form there, et cetera, but everyone is looking for, the new high technology biotech opportunities to try and reinvigorate their local economies, because traditional manufacturing and all of the rest that has gone by the by. So I think that we just have to accept that that's true. And then to Jane's point about virtual, I think that you're right. Particularly during the pandemic, excuse me, we have seen a massive increase in the amount of work that the BD teams have been able to do to support everyone who was trying to put their projects to India and to China or to wherever else was open. So, in the last year, it's been really challenging, but also very easy to work virtually. And that's another facet of the industry. We don't work locally, we work internationally. We have collaborations all over the world, and actually that provides us with quite a different perspective in terms of the way we work. Yes, as a biotech company, it might be good to have staff that are integrated and come together in terms of their day-to-day interactions, but often our collaborations are right around the world 24/7. So we have learned to work that way, and we're very successful at doing that too.
So Tim, in your presentation, you provided us a comparison with, what we have here in the UK versus San Francisco Bay Area and Massachusetts, and I did mention that they are at the moment the three areas that are attracting all the finance. However, we have to be realistic. Despite the UK and certainly the Golden Triangle being the premier cluster within Europe, we're still clearly a long way away from what you have in the US. So I was just wondering, from the fact you've got this global view, and you're very, very much involved in providing that infrastructure, what do you think the UK needs to focus on to create more critical mass? What elements are already in place that just need maintenance?
Yeah, listen, I think all the ingredients are there. If you look at any of the statistics, it's all there. You use the term way back. It is back in aggregate dollars. If you're raising 7 or 8 billion in Boston alone, it is back. But all the components are there. One of the things I think that's incumbent upon both the US and the UK is to make sure, and I think Jane touched on it and Jeremy touched on it, is supportive policies. And at least in the United States, drug pricing gets a lot of headlines. I just think that having supportive policies to encourage capital to come into the industry, whether it is the US or the UK, is extremely important, and we shouldn't take it for granted. I know it makes for great headlines, at least in the US, and I'm sure it does in the UK. But we spend the same amount of money as we spend on drugs as we did in 1960 in the United States. It's the same percentage, somewhere between 12 to 14% of our total healthcare spending. And over time, this innovation becomes a public good. It becomes a generic. Going to the doctor and going to the hospital hospital never gets cheaper. And think about these innovative therapies that are keeping cost avoidance out of the system. So again, it all comes back to approvals. I don't want to get too political, but making sure that you've got a supportive policies. I think both governments can do a really good job, whether they're conservative or you know, more liberal. I think we can all agree that the public good that comes out of this industry, and thank God science and innovation don't stop even in a pandemic. And I also think that, you know, Jane touched on it, you know, people working remotely. I think this industry will help bring people back into the office because they never left, and they'll come back in. And I really believe that we've got to get back together and work in offices. There's a reason Apple spent $1 gazillion for Apple Park in a circle, so people could run into each other. And it's worked great. And there is maybe more flexible models out there, hybrid models out there, flexible or hybrid, depending on what you want to call it. But I think that we got to get back together. We're fortunate enough over the 15 months that we work with most of the people we know. But what about mentoring up the next group of people or the next students that come in? You know, we look at ourselves in the mirror every day and think we're not so exciting, but at least we do have a little wisdom, right? We've been at it a while. So having that next generation, I think we have to get back in the offices. But, you know, getting back to your question, Mike, and I look at statistics and I think, you know, foreign direct investment, you know, is $510 billion in the UK. You know, the UK's share of academic citations is 12%. There's 5,700 patent applications in the UK in 2020. I would argue it's like the England football team. It's just accelerating. They're playing better. The industry's doing better. You know, hopefully you guys will win on Wednesday to get into the finals. Congratulations on beating Germany. But, you know, it's accelerating. The industry seems to be accelerating. And again, I look at numbers, $74 billion in terms of, you know, contribution, 250,000 jobs. You know, it just seems to, and if you look at the percentages of growth, it's consistent with the other markets. And it has all the key components. We're in 5 locations around the world. One of them is the UK, and there's a reason for that. There's 5,800 companies, and there's 72 nodes, not clusters, nodes. I should have said that. Thanks, John. But, you know, 32 million feet is that's nothing to sneeze at. It's very impressive.
So I like the idea of sort of that you're bringing the sort of the football analogy. So, you know, given the fact that, you know, the sort of DNA structure was established here, the sort of the work on, for example, the humanizing of antibodies also was here. That, you know, maybe DNA or biotech is coming home. You know, so I can imagine Tony Jones using that as a sort of a title for maybe Genesis in the future. So but maybe this is just another way I'm going to sort of like, you know, phrase the question. So do you think, okay, I mean, because, you know, the whole this is all about, oh, you know, how do we scale up you know, the ecosystem, etc. And we do look with envy of what goes on in Kendall Square and what goes on in the Bay Area, and also what goes on in San Diego. You know, they've got much better weather for a start. But, you know, are we just, you know, delusional to, or should we not really worry about, you know, comparing ourselves with those I think you call them super clusters? You know, should we actually just sort of, you know, be happy with, you know, what we've got here and actually not worry about, you know, the size?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Listen, I think it's one of the top clusters in the world. You know, I think it's always good to be aspirational to other clusters. I'm sure, you know, San Francisco in a way in the last couple of years has been jealous of Kendall Square in Cambridge. So in San Diego, although I would compare the UK to San Diego, not only in terms of size and investment, which you did, Mike, but it's also the momentum. We have seen tremendous momentum in San Diego, where it has lagged traditionally behind San Francisco and Boston, and also from a tech perspective, also from science and tech, you know, I would consider it that it has a lot of momentum behind it. It's always good to be aspirational, but you know, if you're in one of those top clusters in the world, I think you're doing fine. And there are some growth problems. John did touch on it. There's traffic, there's schools, there's things like that. But 45 minutes to go from King's Cross out to Cambridge, that's faster than I can get across the bridge in San Francisco. So you can get from the talent pool in London to Cambridge fairly quickly, or Oxford. It's not it's similar to a US commute. We're just doing it in our cars. Although we are getting better at public transportation, but it is close enough, but there is some infrastructure limits. I think focusing on infrastructure, not just biotech infrastructure, but roads and schools and access and public transportation as it comes back. I think those are important things to make sure you've got the components that aren't limiting growth.
Okay, so a quick question, because you mentioned about the sort of the healthcare systems. I mean, a key differentiator between the US and what we have in the UK is that we have the sort of a National Health Service, and I'll ask you first, Tim, but maybe others might want to jump in. I just sort of wonder, what role should or does the NHS actually have in the UK life sciences ecosystem, and do we make enough of it?
You've heard enough from me. I'll let John take. John's got his mute off, so you heard enough.
John.
I think the NHS could and should be a huge differentiator. And one of the most, I think, remarkable things about the NHS response over the past year has been starting to see some of that opportunity take shape in the public imagination of what the NHS can do when it shares data effectively and runs trials at scale, etc. So while even in Newmarket, I think a lot of folks not necessarily mourning the previous health secretary's departure, I think one thing he was very bullish about was the power of data in the NHS. And I'm hopeful that one thing that may come out of the past year, other than public recognition of the value of science, is seeing greater enthusiasm for sharing our data as NHS patients as another public good for this industry, and starting to see have that real impact. Because then, if we get that right, we're suddenly Singapore, however many fold larger, with an extraordinary richness of data and information. It should be a great value.
And Tim, in his previous answer, he was sort of talking about sort of comparing the sort of UK with San Diego because of that sort of that tech element, and I just sort of wonder again, a lot of innovation actually, you see the sort of the cross fertilization from one sector to another, where these pinch ideas or adapt or adopt best practices. Again, are we seeing enough of non-core life science companies actually contributing positively to the life sciences ecosystem, and could we do better? Jane.
I'll have a go. I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, Mike, but just something which I've been in Cambridge for 40 years, and one thing that I've always was frustrated by, but I'm no longer, is just that we had, Tim was talking about tribes earlier. Here I can talk about tribes. We had the tech and the not tech, and the two communities did their best to try and kind of keep themselves separate, it seemed. And now, of course, you mentioned San Diego, where they've got a convergence of the tech and the biotech. Of course, Cambridge has this fantastic opportunity with Silicon Fen, maybe not Silicon Valley meets, everything that maybe mass bio has in terms of biotech. So capitalizing on that and making sure, and I think it's happening. I was reading recently about CMR Surgical. So there you've got the engineering, again, masses of great engineers here in Cambridge getting together with scientists and tapping into, the clinicians and coming up with something which is now, a hugely successful. So I think in terms of bringing together, I wouldn't say it's sort of non-core, but just making sure that we take advantage of those opportunities that Cambridge has. And just reflecting sort of the last thing you were talking about, because I have to bring football into this since you raised it. There's just a sort of attitude when we're comparing ourselves with the US. It's a bit like when we watch England play and we all, they're rubbish, they're not going to do any good, we will be kind of beaten by Germany on penalties, and then we're all a bit surprised by what we've just seen. I think there's a bit of that going on perhaps in biotech, in Cambridge as well, we actually do have a lot to celebrate. We shouldn't be complacent, but perhaps one thing we're not as good at the Americans as doing, of sort of blowing our own trumpet and talking about that success and showcasing it to the outside world. I think also Cambridge is well networked as a village, but how penetrable is that to the outside? How easy is it for folk from San Diego or from San Francisco, wherever, really to kind of get into Cambridge and understand what the opportunities are here? Perhaps easier now in the digital age, but I think that's also something that we need to keep an eye on. Anyway, I'll shut up there.
Yeah, no, that's great contributions. James, something to add?
I was going to. I think you've got that massive convergence between biotech and medtech, and Cambridge must be well placed to capitalise on those synergies, which actually brings in that dynamic between life sciences and high tech and deep tech. And I just think we need more. We do need more ambition, but we can't be good at everything. And actually, it's about being more strategic in terms of where we should capitalize on those opportunities going forward.
Okay, so we're really close to the end of the time. So one of the things that Tim was talking about was how having that sort of it's almost like the supportive sort of political framework in which to work. So as a final question, I'd just like to sort of hear from each of the panelists. So you're all going to have to make a comment. What initiatives do you think should be adopted, and by whom, to ensure that we actually have that successful life sciences ecosystem? What should we be doing, and who should be responsible for it? So I'll go in alphabetical order again. So I'll start with you, John.
I'm going to go back to the boring generics. I think we've got to get Cambridge and the broader cluster livable for the earlier career folks that we're all going to rely on to build the next generation of great companies. And I think that has got, so that integrated planning between the commercial infrastructure, housing, schools, etc., has got to be driven. And I think that's one of the few things that can be effectively driven top down, and probably needs to be driven more broadly than locally if we're going to get things through.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I agree. We've heard very encouraging signs that the sector in the UK is actually accelerating in terms of growth, and we need to make sure that we support that, but don't stymie it, because the infrastructure to support it is not catching up. So we just need to be careful about that. Coming back to the earlier point about the NHS and data, I think that's a fantastic opportunity. I just worry that we need to make sure that that data is in an accessible form and is consistent, so that everyone can really mine it and get the maximum benefit from it. It would be a terrible tragedy to have all of that and not be able to actually mine it in an appropriate way. And I know that that's something that we're very focused on in terms of bioinformatics, but I think it has huge potential to actually change things for the better for patients. So that is something we should focus on.
Jane?
Yeah, at the macro level, make sure that we can get capital into the industry. So great move, with pensions and life assurance, and them being able to invest, but more of that. I have to also pick up on what John was saying. You mentioned schools and housing, but transport. Let's sort out the transport in Cambridge, and I think almost that has to be done at the local level. Knocking a few heads together, making sure we can get people to where they need to work.
James?
I agree with everything that's been said, Mike. I think government has a role to play in this as well. So maintaining the competitiveness of the UK. So it's about having the right environment for business, the right incentives, the right regulatory system to drive change.
And Tim, I know that you pointed out that you've actually already had quite a lot of airtime. So you're briefly your one piece of advice that you would give to us here in the UK?
I would say that innovation happens in proximity, not in isolation. So having a wide group of engineers and scientists together, I think is great. You have it in Cambridge. And I appreciate the invitation for someone who's in San Diego with San Francisco in my background here, that you guys would invite me. We miss you tremendously. We cannot wait to be back in the UK. We miss our team. And we can't wait to meet our people. I'm a little emotional because I miss my team. It's been 15 months, and I do appreciate the invitation sincerely, and I can't wait to get back and see you all.
Great. Well, so thanks very much for your presentation at the start, and thanks to the panel. This is a discussion that we're having. It's a perennial one. We're always sort of talking about it. Jane mentioned the fact that we're always beating ourselves up about the fact that are we as good as we would like to be, etc. I think we've had some sort of very interesting sort of views and some of the recommendations. So I think that's probably a great way to sort of bring the conversation to a close. So I'd like to thank all the panelists again for the contributions, and I'll hand back to Aline.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the panel. So yes, it's been a really interesting conversation, and thank you for looping back nicely with the keynote introduction from Anthony Brown on how do we want to fit to government and what do we need. And I thought they were really good comments that you just made. And I think the one keyword I will keep from this panel is momentum. I think you're right, ecosystems or clusters or nodes, whatever we're going to call them, they're not static. It's all about the momentum, and I think we're in a great position sector-wise and geographically wise. So it was great. Thank you very much. So we are now coming to the end of the first day of On Helix Digital. Hope you enjoyed the presentations and discussions as much as I did. If you missed any of them, they will be available in replay of the event app. It is actually the one good thing about digital events is that you can replay discussions. Other benefit, just to mention, is the breadth of on-demand content. And since we discussed a lot the concept of ecosystem, I just wanted to flag that we have really good discussions with our international partners on the key ecosystem enablers for some specific industry areas that you can watch on the on-demand content. And also a range of exclusive fireside chats with senior executives and investors led by Mike. So thank you, Mike, for having contributed to that too. This time is usually when we announce that the drinks are served, but sorry, we're not completely back to normal yet. So instead, we have a really exciting suggestion, which is the Biotech Bikers, who are kindly organizing a networking cycle ride for On Helix delegates. So it's starting at 6:30 on Biomedical Campus side of the DNA path. Sorry, it's very for the Cambridge attendance. And it's a much healthier way to network than the traditional drinks. Maybe less fun, some would argue, but I'm sure there will be fun too. Information is on the app if you're interested, and we're back online tomorrow at 8:55 for a full day of presentations and panel discussion. Hope you will join and see you tomorrow.